This is a true story, and the HOA has long been a thorn in the side of the residents. Here's the full story.
My dad lives in one of those cookie-cutter suburbs you find nestled on the outskirts of pretty much any big US city. You know the type: neat rows of detached houses with perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and streets that curve just so. It's the picture of suburban conformity, designed for quiet living and predictable aesthetics. His neighborhood, naturally, has a homeowners association, a common feature in such places, created ostensibly to maintain property values and community standards. Dad's been a member for years, and for most of that time, his relationship with the HOA, and the neighborhood as a whole, was stellar. Harmonious, even. To understand the drama that unfolded, you first have to understand my dad. He's not just a resident, he's a cornerstone of the community fabric. After working hard his whole life to raise us kids, he embraced retirement not by slowing down, but by channeling his energy into helping others. He's the guy everyone knows. He walks his scruffy terrier, Buster, twice a day, morning and evening, a steady, friendly presence on the sidewalks. He knows just about everyone by name, remembers their kids' ages, and, perhaps most importantly in a dog-loving neighborhood, knows all the dogs and their quirks. He'd stop to chat, offer a word of encouragement, or lend an ear. But Dad wasn't just about friendly waves, he was about action. He's one of those rare individuals who genuinely enjoys helping people and contributing to the collective good. Need an extra pair of hands for the annual neighborhood garage sale setup? Call Dad. Community pool needs a quick repair? Dad's got it. The neighborhood entrance planting needs volunteers? Dad's usually the first one there, shovel in hand. He was, and still is, the go-to guy, the reliable force you could call whenever anything needed doing around the neighborhood. This wasn't just good citizenship, it was practical expertise. See, Dad was trained in his younger years as a handyman and a carpenter. He possesses that invaluable, rapidly disappearing knowledge of how things work and how to fix them with your hands. To add to that, my grandfather, before his passing, owned a private chain of hardware stores. This isn't just a fun fact, it meant my dad inherited not only a deep understanding of tools and materials but also, well, a lot of tools. Tools for every conceivable job, big or small. Power tools, hand tools, obscure tools, you name it, he probably had it. And he wasn't precious about them. He'd happily lend them out to neighbors, offer advice on how to use them, or often, just show up and do the job himself if you looked overwhelmed. He was a one-man neighborhood repair service, powered by goodwill and a lifetime of accumulated hardware. He was, in short, invaluable. Life in the neighborhood flowed smoothly. The HOA collected its dues, oversaw the landscaping of common areas, and occasionally sent out reminders about trash can schedules. The board members were usually just regular folks taking their turn, focused on maintenance rather than micromanagement. This quiet equilibrium began to shift, however, about a year ago. That's when Karen arrived. She wasn't new to the neighborhood entirely, but she had recently retired and, apparently, decided to channel her newfound free time and ample energy into community leadership. She ran for HOA president and, perhaps due to a low voter turnout or an impressive-sounding campaign based on enhanced standards and property value protection, she won. Karen was a type. She had a no-nonsense haircut, always wore crisp, practical clothes, khakis, polos, sensible shoes, and carried herself with an air of self-importance that bordered on the militant. Her smile rarely reached her eyes, which seemed perpetually scanning for imperfections. When Karen took over as president, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed subtly, but noticeably. The gentle reminders from the HOA email list were replaced by sternly worded notices of noncompliance. The focus shifted from essential maintenance to what felt like a war on minor aesthetic deviations. Neighbors started complaining, quietly at first, over the fence or during dog walks. Karen sent me a notice because my bush is apparently an inch too tall, someone would sigh. Did you get the one about the trash cans? Another would grumble. Has to be put away by exactly 7 p.m. on collection day, not 7:01, or you'll be fined. How is that even enforceable? There were stories about notices for a door being the wrong shade of red, it had been that color for 10 years, or for leaving a garden hose coiled visible from the street. The sense of comfortable conformity that had defined the neighborhood began to feel less like shared standards and more like oppressive surveillance. The invisible hand of the HOA under previous presidents became Karen's very visible, very pointed finger, and her ever-present clipboard. It was against this backdrop of rising, low-grade tension that my dad's tool situation reached a critical point. His two-car garage, a standard size for the neighborhood, was meant for cars. Instead, it was a testament to his lifetime of projects and generosity. Every wall was lined with pegboards, every corner stacked with bins and shelves. There were lawnmowers, his and a neighbor's he was fixing, snowblowers, leaf blowers, pressure washers, table saws, miter saws, drill presses, pneumatic tools, ladders of various sizes. It was less a garage and more a compressed hardware store. Getting one car in was a challenge, getting two in required a logistical operation worthy of the military. And he still had tools scattered in the basement and shed, a small plastic one that held gardening supplies. He also had an increasing number of projects around the neighborhood that required larger tools or access to equipment he couldn't possibly keep in the garage, post-hole diggers for fence repairs, a small trench digger for laying irrigation lines, even talk of renting a mini excavator for a community drainage issue. The small plastic shed was useless for housing any of this. Dad, ever the practical problem solver, determined he needed a dedicated outdoor structure to house his overflow of tools and project equipment, freeing up garage space for, well, the car. Dad didn't just go out and buy the first prefab shed he saw. That wasn't his style. He approached it like any other project, with planning and craftsmanship. He designed a shed that was modest in size, about 6 by 8 feet, figuring that was enough to house the bulkier items and overflow tools. He decided to place it at the very back of his property, strategically located along the property line that bordered the street behind his house. The neighborhood properties backed onto a busier road, separated by a green space and a tall privacy fence. The idea was to place it where it would be least visible. He built it himself, framing it out with lumber, putting down a solid foundation. He paid meticulous attention to detail, making sure it was sturdy and weatherproof. Crucially, he designed it with aesthetics in mind, specifically to minimize its visual impact on the neighborhood side. His backyard had high fences running along the sides, blocking the view from direct neighbors. Along the back property line, there were mature pine trees. He planned to position the shed snugly among these trees. He designed the roofline to be simple and pitched, giving it a slightly less utilitarian look. He even planned to install a small, non-functional window and use siding and paint that exactly matched his house. The goal was camouflage, to make the structure blend in so well that you wouldn't notice it unless you were specifically looking for it from certain angles on the back street. If you saw it from the backyard, his intention was for it to look more like an oversized, charming kid's playhouse than a gritty tool shed. He finished the main construction quickly, a solid, well-built frame. He was just starting on the siding and roofing, getting ready to make it disappear into the landscape, when Karen arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Dad was out back, measuring for the siding. Buster was snoozing in a patch of sun. Suddenly, Buster gave a low growl, his ears perked. Dad looked up and saw her. Marching up his driveway, past the side of the house, directly into his backyard. Karen. Clipboard in hand, face set in that familiar, unwavering look of disapproval. She didn't even stop to say hello or acknowledge Buster, who had cautiously come to stand by Dad's leg. She stopped a few feet from the shed frame, scanned it up and down, then fixed her gaze on Dad. D, she began, using his first initial as she often did, a form of address that always felt slightly impersonal coming from her. You can't have that building out back. Dad lowered his tape measure, surprised. Karen? Why not? It's just a shed. It's an accessory structure, she corrected, her voice clipped. And it wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Approved? Dad frowned. For a small shed in my backyard? I designed it so it won't even be visible from the street or the neighbors once I get the siding and roof on. Look, he gestured towards the back property line and the trees. It'll be tucked right in there. Visibility is not the only factor, Karen countered, flipping open her clipboard. There are regulations regarding the size and placement of accessory structures. This appears to exceed the unapproved size guidelines, and its placement wasn't reviewed. Dad felt a prickle of annoyance. He knew the rules generally allowed small sheds. This felt like typical Karen brand overreach. Karen, as you know, I do a lot for the neighborhood. I use my tools and my time to help with various projects. This shed will allow me to house more of those tools here, make them more accessible, and ultimately provide more resources for the community. It's for the benefit of everyone, in a way. Karen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. Her focus was clearly on the rule, not the practical reality or the community contribution. That's irrelevant, D. The rules are in place to maintain neighborhood standards. This structure is against the rules as it stands. If you don't remove it by the end of the month, you will be fined. Significantly. That seems aggressive, Dad said, trying a different tack. He paused, then added, don't you have a small playhouse in your backyard for your daughter? It's visible from some angles. This building is approximately the same size, if not smaller than some I've seen. Karen's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. Her cheeks flushed slightly. That is different, she stated, her voice sharp, dismissing the comparison out of hand. A child's playhouse is a different category. This is a structure. Get rid of it, D, or we will fine you. The board is unified on maintaining standards. She had that smug, unshakable look on her face, the one that said she had already won, that her word was final. She handed him an official-looking notice, not a fine yet, but a formal demand for removal and a warning of impending penalties if he didn't comply within 30 days. She turned and marched back the way she came, leaving Dad standing next to his half-finished, soon-to-be-hidden shed, holding the notice. Buster walked over and nudged his hand, sensing his frustration. Dad was more than frustrated, he was genuinely annoyed. He was being targeted for building a modest shed, one that would actually help him continue being the neighborhood's informal handyman, by someone who seemed more interested in wielding power than fostering community spirit. The comparison to her playhouse, so quickly dismissed, stuck in his craw. That is different. The sheer hypocrisy and arbitrary nature of it was galling. But as he looked at the notice, and then at the shed he had planned so carefully to be unobtrusive, something shifted in his mind. Karen's words, that is different, echoed. And her smug confidence that she could just order him to tear down his work that was ultimately beneficial to the neighborhood, sparked something beyond annoyance. It sparked a quiet, strategic resolve. He wasn't just going to comply. He wasn't just going to grumble about it. He was going to find a way. He thought about Karen's absolute certainty, her reliance on the rules. Fine. He'd play by the rules. But he'd play by all the rules. Dad didn't touch the shed's frame for a few days. He spent that time inside, not watching TV or tinkering, but buried in paperwork. He pulled out the entire, thick binder of the HOA's covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC and RS. He got highlighters, sticky notes, and a large cup of coffee. He read every single page. Every clause, every subsection, every addendum. It was tedious, dense with legal jargon, and incredibly boring. But he was looking for something specific. Something that might offer an alternative interpretation, a loophole, a way around Section 3.b. Whatever that Karen was citing. He highlighted sections on accessory structures, property improvements, aesthetic guidelines. He found plenty of rules about fence heights, mailbox styles, approved exterior paint colors, and landscaping requirements. It painted a picture of the meticulously controlled environment Karen was so keen to uphold. Hours bled into days. His frustration grew with each page that seemed to reinforce the HOA's power. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe he would have to tear it down. The thought was infuriating. Then, late one evening, slumped in his armchair, eyes scanning the dense text, he saw it. A seemingly innocuous section, tucked away, far from the rules about sheds or fences. A section titled Yard Ornamentation and Features. It discussed things like bird baths, statues, and decorative items. And in there, a line that made him sit up straight, his fatigue momentarily forgotten: art installations are permitted in a member's backyard, provided they do not create a nuisance or violate other community standards, e.g., height restrictions if applicable to structures. Art installations. The rule didn't define art installation. It didn't specify a size limit for art pieces, other than vaguely referencing height restrictions applicable to structures, but the shed wasn't a structure anymore, was it? Not if it was art. A slow smile spread across Dad's face. It wasn't Karen's smug smirk, it was a genuine, slightly mischievous grin. Art installation, he muttered to himself. Well, isn't that interesting? He immediately went to find my mom. Mom is, conveniently, an artist. She paints, sculpts, creates all sorts of wonderful, often colorful and whimsical things. He showed her the section, explained the situation with Karen and the shed. Mom read the rule, then looked at Dad, then back at the rule. A similar mischievous light sparked in her eyes. So, she said slowly, a grin forming, you want me to help you turn your shed into art? Exactly. Dad said, his voice buzzing with newfound energy. And it needs to be undeniably art. Something that fits the description, uses the loophole, and, well, something Karen can't ignore, but also can't technically rule against under this section. Mom, who had her own quiet frustrations with some of Karen's neighborhood dictates, her carefully arranged collection of garden gnomes had received a passive-aggressive mention in a general newsletter about appropriate lawn decor, was instantly on board. This wasn't just about Dad's shed anymore, it was about a creative, slightly rebellious pushback against arbitrary control. The planning session between my handyman father and my artist mother was, I imagine, a fascinating blend of practicality and whimsy. How do you turn a 6 by 8 foot shed frame into undeniable art? It had to be visible, it had to be clearly not just a shed, and it had to reference art installation in the most in-your-face, yet rule-following, way possible. They started brainstorming. The siding couldn't be boring house paint anymore. What's readily available, visually interesting, and undeniably constructed? License plates. Dad had a small collection, and neighbors, hearing he was looking for old ones, he asked around, casually mentioning it was for a project, happily donated theirs. Covering the shed sides entirely in overlapping, colorful license plates began the transformation from structure to assemblage. They added a window to the door, not a plain square, but a bright, vibrant octagon. It gave the shed a slightly whimsical, almost cartoonish look. It was becoming less a playhouse and more, well, something else entirely. But it needed a focal point, something that screamed art installation and was big enough to justify the scale. Something that Karen couldn't dismiss. It needs a sculpture, Mom declared. Something large. Something clearly decorative, not functional. They looked at the shed, covered in license plates, the octagon window gleaming. You know, Dad said, tilting his head. With the pitched roof and the window, it almost looks like an oversized birdhouse. Mom's eyes lit up. A birdhouse? Yes. But not a functional one. A giant, artistic bird. Made of license plates, of course. And so, the centerpiece was conceived, a 7-foot-tall bird statue, constructed entirely from license plates, mounted prominently on the side of the shed, angled just so that it was visible not only from the backyard but also peeking over the fence from the back street, and even slightly from the sides if you walked past on the main neighborhood street. They gave it large, googly eyes made of ceramic, painted a huge, cheerful smiley face on its head, and, for the piece de resistance, Mom found a giant, vibrant purple feather boa that they wrapped around its neck like a scarf. The finished art installation was magnificent in its sheer, unadulterated gaudiness. The shed, now covered in a mosaic of license plates, looked like a psychedelic, oversized birdhouse. And the bird statue, towering and resplendent in its purple boa, was impossible to ignore. It was loud. It was quirky. It was definitely not a discreet shed blending into the landscape. It was undeniably, unequivocally, art. And it was glorious. They finished the installation late on a Saturday afternoon. Dad stood back, admiring his handiwork and Mom's artistic flair. Buster trotted over, sniffed cautiously at the base of the giant bird, and seemed to approve. Less than 24 hours later, on Sunday morning, Karen arrived. She came with purpose again, walking directly to the back of the property. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw it. Her jaw literally dropped. Her eyes, usually scanning for rogue blades of grass, seemed unable to process the riot of color and unexpected form that now occupied the back of Dad's yard. She finally sputtered, her voice tight with disbelief and outrage. What is that thing? She gestured wildly at the license plate birdhouse and its feathered guardian. And why is your structure still there? Dad walked over, calm as can be, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. Good morning, Karen. That? He gestured to the flamboyant creation. That's an art installation. Karen's face, already pale with shock, began to turn red. An art installation? Don't be ridiculous. That's an eyesore. It's against the rules. You have to remove it immediately. No, it's not, Dad said, his voice even. Yes, it is. Karen's voice rose, bordering on a shriek. It's clearly an unauthorized structure. You just tried to cover it up. No, Dad repeated, shaking his head slowly. I looked into the HOA rules very carefully, Karen. Section X, subsection Y, paragraph C, he cited the specific clause he had found. It states that art installations are permitted in a member's backyard. That is exactly what I have done. This is an art installation. And, he added, the mischievous glint returning to his eyes, the best part is, this installation can also house all of my tools, fulfilling a practical need while adhering to the art installation provision of the rules. Karen was speechless for a moment. Her face was now a deep, alarming shade of crimson. She stared at the gaudy bird, then at the license plate shed, then at Dad, who simply stood there, calm and polite. She flipped through her clipboard frantically, as if the answer to this absurdity must be written there somewhere. But she knew, in that moment, that under the current rules, Dad had found a loophole. He hadn't removed a structure, he had installed art. Unspeakably tacky, attention-grabbing art, yes, but art nonetheless, according to the generous, undefined terms of the CC and RS. Her initial outrage shifted, replaced by that familiar smug look, though this time it seemed tinged with malice. She snapped her clipboard shut. Fine, she said, her voice low and tight with suppressed fury. Fine. We will vote on this. At the upcoming HOA meeting in 2 weeks' time. We will vote to amend the rule on art installations and vote to have that, she jabbed a finger towards the bird, as if she couldn't bear to name it, removed. The board will ensure it. She spun on her heel and strode away, leaving Dad alone with his vibrant, rule-following, tool-housing art installation. Dad watched her go, his smile fading slightly. He knew what her smugness meant this time. She hadn't been defeated, she had just changed the battlefield. She intended to use the HOA's ultimate power, the ability to change the rules, to eliminate his loophole and force him to comply. She was confident she had the board and enough community support to do it. She walked away leaving him with a looming threat and a lot to think about. Karen, however, still fundamentally underestimated the person she was dealing with. She knew Dad was the neighborhood handyman. She knew he helped people. But she didn't understand the depth of goodwill he had cultivated, thread by thread, interaction by interaction, over the years. And she certainly didn't know about his secret weapon. Margaritas. See, Dad, being like any sensible retired man who enjoys the simple pleasures in life, had developed a fondness for margaritas. A serious fondness. So much so that he had assembled a dedicated margarita cart in his garage, a small, wheeled trolley stocked with tequila, triple sec, lime juice, salt, glasses, and a good shaker. The neighbors knew about Dad's margaritas. It wasn't a scheduled event, it was more of a spontaneous neighborhood signal. Whenever Dad had his garage door up on a pleasant afternoon, and a particular small pirate flag displayed on his mailbox, a quirky gift from one of his grandkids, it meant one thing: driveway margaritas were happening. Neighbors walking their dogs, kids on bikes, or folks just getting home would see the flag, hear maybe a little music playing softly from the garage, and wander over. It became a charming, unofficial neighborhood tradition, impromptu gatherings in Dad's driveway, sharing a cold drink and conversation. It was just one more way Dad fostered connection and community spirit, one salted rim at a time. Karen, in her focused pursuit of rule enforcement, likely saw these gatherings, if she noticed them at all, as minor, unregulated social events, perhaps a potential noise violation waiting to happen, though Dad was always mindful of keeping the music and chatter at a neighborly level. She certainly didn't see them as a strategic asset. Dad knew the vote was coming. He knew Karen was working behind the scenes, talking to her allies on the board, perhaps putting out feelers in the neighborhood to gauge support for changing the art rule and getting rid of his flamboyant installation. He could have tried distributing flyers arguing his case, knocking on doors to explain the situation rationally. But Dad had a better plan. He decided to fight Karen's bureaucratic power and political maneuvering with community grassroots support, fueled by his well-earned goodwill and a generous supply of citrusy, salty goodness. So, starting the very next day, Dad did what he does best. Every couple of days that week, especially in the late afternoons when people were getting home from work, he put out the pirate flag, rolled the margarita cart into the driveway, plopped down a folding chair, and waited. And they came. Neighbors, drawn by the flag, the familiar setup, the promise of a refreshing drink and a friendly chat. As they sipped their margaritas, Dad would, in his easy, non-confrontational way, bring up the upcoming HOA meeting. He'd mention Karen's plan to vote on his art installation. He wouldn't just talk about the shed, he'd frame it in the broader context of Karen's recent crackdowns. Heard about Jim's bush notice? And poor old Mrs. Gable got a warning about her bird feeder. He'd talk about needing space for tools he used to help the neighborhood. He'd laugh about the absurdity of turning his shed into a giant bird, but emphasize that he did it because the rules allowed it, and now Karen wanted to change the rules just to target him. He wasn't asking for favors, he was reminding people, gently but clearly, of all he did for them, contrasting it with the petty, negative enforcement style Karen had introduced. He was reminding them what kind of neighborhood they used to have, and what it was becoming under Karen. And he was doing it over free margaritas, in a relaxed, friendly setting. He didn't explicitly tell people how to vote. He didn't have to. He just asked them to show up to the meeting. Come down to the meeting next week, he'd say, pouring another margarita. Just want people to see what's going on. Your vote matters. All week, the margarita cart was busy. Different groups of neighbors rotated through. The word spread. The story of the giant license plate bird and Karen's fury became the talk of the neighborhood, often accompanied by a shared laugh and a clinking glass. The resentment that had been simmering under Karen's rule found a focal point, a tangible symbol in Dad's gaudy art, and a rallying point in Dad's driveway. The day of the big community vote arrived. Dad went about his morning routine, walked Buster, had his coffee. There was a quiet anticipation in the air. He didn't know exactly how many people would show up, but he felt a sense of calm confidence. He had put in the work, not just the previous week with the margaritas, but for years, building genuine connections and helping his neighbors. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the small community room at the pool house. Dad arrived a little early and was stunned. Stunned and deeply touched. The room had a capacity limit, maybe 50 or 60 people max. The chairs were already mostly full. And there was a line. A line of people stretching out the door and down the path, residents who had come to attend the HOA meeting. People were standing in the back, along the walls. It wasn't just the usual handful of concerned residents, it was a significant portion of the neighborhood. Karen's decision to bring this public had backfired spectacularly. Karen arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand, ready to conduct the meeting. As she walked towards the front of the crowded room, a look of absolute shock spread across her face. She clearly hadn't expected this turnout. Her eyes darted around, taking in the sea of faces, most of them not her usual allies. She looked bewildered, uncomfortable. She had expected to pass her motion quietly, maybe with a few dissenters. She was facing a packed town hall. She had underestimated the power of community, and the quiet influence of Dad's goodwill and his margarita diplomacy. She started the meeting, rushing through the initial agenda items. Her voice was slightly more strained than usual. Then, a few minutes in, she got to the point. Next on the agenda, she announced, trying to regain her composure, is a vote regarding an unauthorized structure, which the resident is attempting to classify as art. She avoided making eye contact with Dad, who was sitting calmly in the front row, Buster lying quietly at his feet. The board proposes amending the art installation clause for clarity and requiring the removal of the structure at Dad's address, due to aesthetic and compliance issues. She presented her case, stiffly reciting rules and standards, portraying the license plate bird as a blatant violation that threatened the visual integrity of the neighborhood. She called for the vote. All in favor of amending the rule and requiring the removal of the art installation? Karen said, looking around with that familiar, hopeful smile, though it seemed weaker now. A few hands went up around the table, her core group on the board, her staunchest allies. Maybe 4 or 5 hands in total in the entire room. A tense pause hung in the air. Karen's smile faltered. All of those against? She asked, her voice barely audible, perhaps already dreading the answer. The moment felt monumental. Slowly at first, then in a wave that swept across the room, hands shot up. A forest of hands. Every single person in the packed audience, standing in the back, lining the walls, their hands went up. It was overwhelming. It was undeniable. It was a clear, resounding, neighborhood-wide NO. Karen's face went white, then scarlet again. She stared at the sea of raised hands, her mouth slightly open. She had lost. Decisively. The handful of votes for her motion was swallowed whole by the sheer number of residents who had shown up, thanks to Dad's quiet efforts and generous hospitality, to vote against her overreach. Dad could have brought a quarter of the people who showed up, and they still would have beat her handedly. But the sheer turnout, the undeniable visual representation of community opposition, was devastating. The vote was tallied quickly, though the outcome was already clear. Karen's motion was overwhelmingly defeated. Not only would Dad's art installation stay, but her attempt to change the rules to target him had failed spectacularly. The immediate aftermath was swift. The board members, seeing the clear lack of support for Karen's leadership style and her increasingly arbitrary enforcement, moved quickly. There was a brief, awkward discussion, and then, a motion was made and passed to remove Karen from the position of HOA president, effective immediately. One of the other board members, a longtime resident whom Dad had helped fix a fence just last year, stepped in as interim president. Karen, visibly shaken and humiliated, gathered her clipboard and papers with trembling hands. She didn't say another word. She simply stood up and walked out of the meeting room, the door closing softly behind her. Life in the neighborhood didn't instantly transform into a utopian paradise overnight. The HOA still exists, still collects dues, still enforces rules. But the atmosphere changed. The oppressive cloud of petty crackdowns began to lift. The new interim president, and the board that remained, seemed to take a lesson from the packed meeting and the decisive vote. Enforcement became more reasonable, more focused on actual issues affecting the community, less on micromanaging shrub heights and trash can timings. The Welcome to Freedom banner might as well have been hung metaphorically over the neighborhood entrance. And the art installation? The license plate birdhouse with its towering, purple boa-clad guardian? It still stands. Years later, long after Karen's name became something of a legend whispered with a mix of humor and disdain, the art installation remains firmly rooted in Dad's backyard. It's no longer just a point of conflict, it's a landmark. A conversation starter for new residents. A visual reminder of the time a seemingly ordinary man, armed with bylaws and good humor, and good margaritas, stood up to arbitrary authority and won, rallied his neighbors, and reminded everyone that a community's strength lies not in rigid conformity imposed from above, but in the connections and goodwill shared among its residents. Every time I visit, I see it, the glint of license plates, the cheerful, slightly absurd face of the giant bird peeking over the fence. Dad still uses the shed portion to house his tools, which he still happily lends out or uses to help neighbors. Buster still naps nearby. It wasn't just about a shed, or even about art. It was about fighting for your right to live reasonably on your own property. It was about the power of knowing the rules better than the people trying to enforce them. It was about the incredible strength found in community solidarity, built quietly, one act of kindness, one shared conversation, one spontaneous margarita at a time. It was about a regular guy, my dad, proving that you don't need a formal title or institutional power to defend your home and help your neighbors push back against petty tyranny. To anyone out there facing their own version of HOA Karen, or any small-scale bureaucracy making your life unnecessarily difficult, learn the rules. Find your loophole. Connect with your neighbors. Build your community. And don't underestimate the power of goodwill, persistence, and finding your own unique, maybe slightly gaudy, way to stand firm. Sometimes, the most effective weapon against overbearing authority is a well-placed piece of defiant art and a community united over margaritas. Fight for your home. Fight for your peace. Fight for your right to put up a ridiculous license plate bird if the rules say you can.